Welcome to the US Daily Brief channel. Russian President Vladimir Putin has challenged the United States and Europe in Russia's current state by making striking statements and claims against the United States and Europe, and ridiculed himself by claiming that Russia has deferred Western sanctions. He also surprised the EU-Ukraine relations by saying that he has no objections. Well, does Putin really not object to Ukraine's effort to join the EU? And does Russia's temporary economic recovery under such heavy economic sanctions prove that it has defeated the US and Europe? Or is Putin's statement just a joke, like an old Soviet ammunition and the fiasco Russian army? Let's dive into some of the most striking recent statements by Russian President Putin and the real current situation. While the war in the east of Europe continues with all its harshness, Russian President Vladimir Putin made very important statements at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, known as Russia's Davos, the other day. Talking about the sanctions against Russia and the Russian economy, the most important topic in Putin's statement was what he said about Ukraine's idea of joining the European Union. Putin, who criticizes the USA and NATO harshly and criticizes the West, said that he is not against Ukraine joining to the European Union. When Russian President Vladimir Putin was asked about Ukraine's prospect for joining to European Union, he said he had no objections for Ukraine joining to European Union. Following European Commission's historic decision and support Kiev's bid to join, it's kind of hard to say what that means. So far, Russia's word and actions have not matched, and it's necessary to consider the possibility that this may be a diversion. Maybe it's a strategic statement for him or some kind of propaganda or a diversion. However, the president of Russia may have said this seriously because he thinks that the EU is an economic bloc and it's impossible for them to include Ukraine in the alliance in the current situation. Stating that the European Union is not a military bloc, Putin said that he supports the economic empowerment of its neighbors and made statements that make it meaningless why the Russian army is currently in Ukraine. At the beginning of the attempted invasion of Eastern Europe in late February, Putin had taken a stand against Ukraine's attempts to join the NATO military alliance for years. This issue came to a deadlock between the Kremlin and the West. And as a result, with Putin's statement on February 24, the Russian army entered Ukraine. Just before Putin sent tens of thousands of his soldiers and thousands of tanks and warplanes to Ukraine, he had asked the US for legal guarantees that Ukraine would not join the Nordic Atlantic Alliance. Speaking about the Ukraine's European accession process, another Russian diplomat, Dmitry Peskov, stated that the Kremlin is closely following Ukraine's efforts to become a member of the European Union. He declared that the European Union is not a military bloc at the moment, but that the possibility of its transformation into a military bloc is also being considered. As you may recall, in the last months of 2021, French President Emmanuel Macron said in his statements that NATO was unqualified and dysfunctional, arguing that the European Union should now have its own military power. Macron saw how the presence of NATO provided an environment of trust with Russia's invasion attempts months after these statements. This is thought to be an issue that Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov talked about. Peskov thinks that the European Union is currently an alliance based on economic and social cooperation, but if it turns into a military partnership in the future, events will be discussed in a completely different dimension. Putin, on the other hand, states that he is looking forward to Ukraine's entry into the European Union for now, and claims that this will not be accepted by the European Union, underlining the hard blow that the Ukraine's economic bottleneck may have on the European Union economy. Putin does not see it's highly likely for European Union member states to look forward to this merger. In his statements at the summit in St. Petersburg, Putin also touched upon many different important topics. Defying the West, Putin stated that the Western order is collapsing and that Russia has overcome the economic and diplomatic shocks it has suffered due to the invasion of Ukraine. Russia's president has broadly condemned the United States and defended its fiscal policies. but largely avoided discussing the war in a speech to Russia's flamboyant economic forum, which was delayed by a blatant cyber attack. Putin, who almost never mentioned the invasion attempt in Ukraine, brought to the fore the issues that he saw as valid on the Russian economy and harshly criticized the sanctions of the West. At the same time, stating that the era of the global dominance of the United States is over, Putin claimed that the economic sanctions imposed on Russia by Washington and his Western allies had failed. He also said that by claiming victory after the Cold War, the United States treated other countries like a colony and that this was a big mistake. Speaking very briefly about the invasion attempt in Ukraine, Putin said that Russia has started a war to protect Russian-speaking people in eastern Ukraine. And this initiative is based on a sovereign country's decision to defend its own rights. Regarding the outcome of the war, he emphasized that he believed that Russia would achieve all its goals at the end of this war. In fact, from these statements, we see that Putin has moved away from regional realities. Even though the Russian army has made small progress in the Donbas region in recent days, it has suffered a very serious loss in Ukraine. When we look at the overall total, in fact, the Russian army has already lost as important ammunition as the total number of armored vehicles and warplanes in the army arsenal of most countries. In addition, there is a loss of Russian soldiers approaching 35,000. From this point of view, Putin's belief does not seem to be very realistic belief. After all, even it's assumed that this war lasted for many years and Russia won, the losses that Russia suffered in the region will leave it with a completely depleted army. And this will only be the military result of the war. At the same time, this war has economic consequences for Russia. Despite Western sanctions, Russia has been trying to display a positive economic chart by selling its natural resources to Eastern countries at cheaper prices. However, the sanctions imposed on Russia are more severe than they seem, and are not so simple that they can be explained with a simple 4-month economic picture. It is known that there is a long-standing shortage of spare parts in Russian industry. It was even announced that many Russian industrial blocs closed their shutters. At the same time, even though Russia seems to be managing this process with its reserve money, it is a matter of curiosity how long it can withstand these sanctions from the West. Putin, on the other hand, does not evaluate this issue in that way, and states that despite the damage the European Union has inflicted on its own economy, he imposes sanctions on Russia at the behest of Washington, and says the European Union has completely lost its political sovereignty. He also claims that Western politicians falsely blame their country's inflation on the war in Ukraine to distract the public from excessive Western government spending and loose monetary policy, which he identifies as the real causes. Saying that the growing inflation in the world may cause hunger in poor countries, Putin cites the US and European state administrators as responsible for this. Putin appealed to Russian investors, asking them to keep their money in Russia, and said that the sanctions imposed by the West show how reasonable it was to invest in the domestic economy. Citing the Western sanctions against Russian oligarchs as an example, Putin said that these sanctions carry very good lessons for Russian investors. Considering these statements of Russian President Vladimir Putin, it would not be wrong to think that he's selling dreams to his own investors. It will never be a logical move for investors to keep their investments in a completely isolated economic ecosystem. At the same time, the main reason for the recent inflation crisis and global food shortages is thought to be the war waged by Russia. In the period when all world economies were shaken with the COVID-19 pandemic, Russia's invasion attempt and the inability of Ukraine, which is seen as the world's granary, and Russia's inability to make these shipments, have caused volatile figures in inflation. According to experts, in order to stop the economic sway, first of all, a safe commercial environment should be provided, and people should not scam to inflation in terms of basic needs. But when you take the grain, which is the most basic need of people, the result will go here, which has a very clear result. No matter how much Putin criticizes the West with his statements, he continues to lose confidence in the Kremlin and witness the decline of support from his own society. This war in Ukraine will continue to cause bigger problems for Putin with each passing day. These problems, unfortunately, can cease to be military, diplomatic, and political. Then they can cause much more problems, especially to the innocent Ukrainian people and the Russian people who are against the war. In the continuation, it can condemn the world to inflation and many poor countries to famine. And here, there is a dictatorship leader who is trying to confront the whole world and put blame for all this on Europe and the USA. We hope that all negativities will be resolved as soon as possible and this cruelty will be punished.